I'd like to acknowledge the tangata whenua of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and pay respects to their ancestors and elders.
The wine industry is quite interesting from that point of view, in that you get sort of sciencey people attracted to it, but you also get quite artsy people attracted to it as well too. And a combination of both is probably the ideal.
This is Over a Glass. I'm Shanteh Wale. Clive Jones joined Nautilus Estate as winemaker in 1998. Today, he still holds that title, now carrying the wisdom of decades on his shoulders. It's no surprise then that he is crafting some of New Zealand's most captivating wines. Kia ora, Clive. Thanks for joining me.
Kia ora. Lovely to be here.
Well, we were together not too long ago at the beautiful Nautilus Estate and trying some impeccable wines. So I am so thrilled that you had the time during this very busy season of your life to come and have a chat with me.
Yeah, all good. In fact, the harvest has been over for a couple of weeks, so we're almost on wind down mode at the moment, but we can keep that quiet if you want. I can still pretend to be super busy.
Well, I'm sure you've got a few other things going on. Does it take a little while to kind of come down off that high after vintage?
Yeah, it does. We've still got our vintage crew here, so it's a really interesting dynamic about vintage. You get a group of people come in and you work closely together for a short period of time, but you spend more time at work than you do at home, so they become like this quite tight-knit family almost, and then they all disappear. So you can get vintage withdrawals to a certain extent because suddenly that sort of buzz and dynamic is gone. But it also can be quite nice to have the place back to yourself again, and you can kind of think about, right, no, I don't have to think about what everyone else is doing. I can focus on what needs to be done for the next stage for the wine. So, and clear your thoughts and start looking forward to the rest of the year.
Yeah, because it's not a huge amount of time where there's nothing to do, is it? It kind of starts again, the cleaning and everything that you need to do. I want to go back a little bit and get your background. Where did you grow up and what was your kind of upbringing like, Clive?
I was, my parents were immigrated from the UK in the post-war years. So I think in Australia and New Zealand, you could get passage over to this part of the world for £10. They were called £10 POMs. Mum and Dad were married, so they weren't eligible for that. So they sailed to New Zealand in the 50s. Dad was quite progressive. He actually shipped a car out from the UK. So they picked up a car in Wellington and drove all around the country looking for somewhere to live, and ended up settling in Hamilton. So the Australian equivalent to that would be to end up settling in somewhere like Wagga Wagga, a sort of rural service town in the heartland of the country, but not a coastal beach or anything like that. But look, the reality is that's where the job was. So yeah, I was born in Hamilton. There's a few winemakers that have a Hamilton connection actually, but we generally keep it quiet. It's known as the Tron, the city of the future. But we used to holiday in the Coromandel Peninsula, which is a couple of hours drive from Hamilton. And Dad got a transfer. He worked for the post office, which is the telephone exchange, and he got a transfer to Thames, which is a small town at the base of the Coromandel Peninsula, which is a beautiful part of New Zealand. So my high school years were spent there, and then I moved to Auckland to go to university and did a degree in chemistry. I was into science, and then worked in a lab for a few years, and then got the wine bug.
I've heard a few different segues to becoming a winemaker or to be in the industry. And an industrial chemist is not a terrible far removal in terms of some of the skills that you also need as a winemaker. What kind of turned around? How did you get the wine bug?
Well, I started drinking this stuff. and I guess, look, I was, a chemistry background's really useful. It's not necessary, but it's useful, and it's sometimes for, and the wine industry is quite interesting from that point of view, in that you get sort of sciencey people attracted to it, but you also get quite artsy people attracted to it as well too. And a combination of both is probably the ideal. But sort of having that chemistry background is a really good solid base that it's easy to fall back to. But I guess when I was at university in the 80s, the New Zealand wine industry in the late 80s, early 90s was just waking up. Wine wasn't a part of my upbringing. We would have a glass of sparkling wine on Christmas Day with the family, but that was about it. So I guess in a experimentation with alcohol as a teenager with your schoolmates on New Year's Eve parties and things, you might try a bit of wine, but wasn't till really university years and post-university years when, and I think by that stage I had my chemistry degree and I was working in a lab where we were actually kind of doing second-generation product development. So people would come to us with a product that they'd seen overseas and say, hey, we want to make this in New Zealand to make our fortune. What's in it? So I would always look, you buy or pick up a bottle of something off the shelf in the supermarket, and turn around and see the ingredient list. And because that's, and I started looking at bottles of wine and going, well, hang on, why does this bottle of wine taste different to this bottle of wine? And, and sort of that whole mystery about sense of place and where wine comes from, but, wondering why, how these wines get to this place, and then started, drinking and enjoying and consuming wine. And then I did a wine course and, got a bit more knowledge, and it really became the point where I was either going to become a wine enthusiast and drink wine for the rest of my, life and from a consumer point of view, but I did see it as being something I could easily transition to from a career point of view. I had another mate who went through university who did master's degrees that was wine related, and I caught up with him too. He ended up working for Villa Maria early on, and I did a tour around Villa Maria in Auckland. And it got to the point where I thought, I'm going to have to give this a crack. So at that stage, and in New Zealand, you could do a postgraduate degree down at Lincoln University in Christchurch. But so I was on the verge of doing that, and a cellar hand job came up with Celax Wines in Auckland, in West Auckland. And I approached them and had an interview, and they said, why don't you come and work for us? And instead of doing your postgrad, top up your degree through Charles Sturt University in Wagga Wagga by distance education. So I went into that role. I could do all the lab work, so that was a big tick for them. That was something I could easily do straight away. So I ended up topping up my science degree with a wine science degree, which took me 4 years, but doing it by distance education. So I then, effectively then had an apprenticeship in the West Auckland wine scene, which is the heritage scene for New Zealand. So, I was working for Celax just up the road with was Kumia River and the Brackoviches, the Spence brothers at Matua. So there was a real good scene there that, as a training ground was perfect.
They must have, first of all, seen that there was potential there with you. Did you find any of it really challenging, or did you find that it all kind of made sense? Because when you talked about picking up, a product and looking at the back label and looking at ingredients, I can see why wine would have fascinated you, because there wasn't much on there, there wasn't a whole bunch of grapes and not a lot of detail on the back label for you to be able to work out why they taste like they do. So, yeah, how did you find learning about wine? Was it challenging or, easy?
Well, it was easy in the sense that, sometimes when you leave, I wanted to go to university. I was good at science, I guess, as a subject. So I did a science degree. I fell into chemistry because I thought, well, that's where the jobs will be. Rather than, say, botany or something like that. But then, 6 years later, when I went back to university, all of a sudden you're studying specifically about something you're really interested in. So that learning process becomes quite a bit easier. Apart from I had to go for 2 days in Wagga to do a statistics paper. And I couldn't believe that my previous degree I didn't have a statistics paper, and I couldn't get a cross credit for that. But there's no way I could get out of it, and that was just that seemed like a complete waste of time. But to go all the way to Wagga for 2 days for a statistics paper workshop, but yeah, so it was hard work in that I was working full time and doing effectively half a full-time university course during the year as well. So, I was glad I got that all over and done with before we had kids. But so it was quite time-consuming, but I found it relatively easy because I was enthusiastic about the subject.
Yeah, it does make a huge difference. I agree. And it is good that we push ourselves in those young years, isn't it? I often think when you look back, you think, God, that seems like far too much effort and far too much work. Thank God I did it when I was young.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Now, tell me about the move to Marlborough. How did that come about?
Well, I guess, I'd done 6 years with CLAX because I worked, I started in March just at vintage time. I worked through that year and then enrolled in university for the following year. It took 4 years to top up my degree. So, I kind of had to do about 2/3 of the full course, and the rest I got cross-credited. Then I worked for another year. And I guess the one thing I wasn't really that connected with working in Auckland was vineyards. They had a small vineyard around the winery, but the majority of their fruit was actually being trucked up from Marlborough, and some from Gisborne. And my first vintage was 1992, so and the winery really was waking up during the 90s, and Marlborough was expanding so much, and then that Marlborough was becoming a kind of the main centre, if you like, of the New Zealand wine industry. And so getting closer to the action as to where the grapes had appeal. And by that stage, CLAX had built a winery in Marlborough, and my boss at the time had moved down to Marlborough. And so I was left in Auckland, receiving juice and fermenting and bottling and things like that, but I was kind of even more removed in some ways from the grapes. So it kind of looked like the timing was right to move. We'd just had our first child, so moving out of Auckland into a more rural environment for bringing up a family had appeal as well too. So the job came up with Nautilus, and I applied and was successful in getting it, and have been here ever since.
Incredible that it was the right job for you at the right time, and for over 26 years. I mean, when I hear that people have been at a place for that amount of time, you certainly know that there's so much going on to keep you there, but also that the culture and everything else must really be of a high standard. Otherwise, why would you stay? Tell me a little bit about your experience of working for one company for that amount of time.
Yeah, so and we, Nautilus is part of Hillsmith Family Estates, so the Yalumba wine company in Australia, essentially. So Nautilus was Robert Hillsmith's idea. He came over to New Zealand and created the brand. And when I joined the brand, there was just myself and one other person in the office, and the wines were made at a contract winemaking facility. And we had 2 company vineyards and a reasonable grower base. So over the next 10 years, or 8 years, in fact, so one of my, I joined in August 98. Within a year, I was involved in a project building our specialised Pinot Noir winery, which we built in 2000. And then, so it's like, what often happens with, and with Nautilus, the brand came first, and then, sourced fruit, bought vineyards, was a shareholder in this contract winemaking facility, but there's a natural progression where you get to the point where it makes sense to sell out of the shareholding in the cooperative facility and build your own facility. And we started with a Pinot Noir facility because at that stage, in 2000, Pinot was really only being talked about seriously in Marlborough by a few people as table wine. We'd obviously been using it for sparkling. So 2000, I got to be involved in a project building a Pinot Noir winery, and then 2006, building a project for the white wine winery to go beside it. So, over that first 10 years, there was a lot going on. And also the company was investing in either buying vineyards or establishing vineyards as well too. So, that 10 years from 98 through to 2008 was a period of, big change and excitement and growth, and that was going on throughout the Marlborough region as well. So being part of that was a great opportunity.
Yeah, I feel that that makes sense, that you would have to have quite a bit going on to keep you interested, to keep you growing, and for you to talk about what that business established as to now where it's grown to is pretty amazing. Talk us through just the breadth of wines that you make now, and what's next.
Cool. Yeah. So it started off. So the first vintage was 1985. So we're just actually celebrating 40 years this year. So last year was technically our 40th vintage. So the story goes, Robert was over here in New Zealand looking at selling Australian wine, and saw potential in the New Zealand wine industry. He went back to Australia and spoke to his dad and said, "Hey, I think we should invest in New Zealand." And his dad said, "You're nuts. The Kiwis are good at rugby, not bad at cricket, breed good racehorses, but they make rubbish wine," which was a pretty fair assessment at the time. This would have been the early 80s. And nevertheless, Robert established the Nautilus brand and also the Negotiants New Zealand distribution business in 1985. And I didn't hear this story until I'd been working for the business for about, I think we were opening the white wine winery in 2006, and one of his regrets was his father actually passed away relatively soon after that, and he never actually kind of got to say "I told you so," And for Robert Hall Smith, who's fifth generation, oldest family wine company in Australia, or oldest continuous family wine company in Australia, his legacy to the family business, or part of his legacy to the family business, is taking it international. So taking it into New Zealand, and I include Tasmania in that as well as being international. But so Nautilus has a special part in Robert's heart because he created it as a brand. Didn't come in and buy an existing business, created the brand, and then started resourcing it. And then we went through that phase of going, building wineries, etc. So we started with 200 cases of Sauvignon Blanc that was sent back to Australia and sold in Australia. So we've been selling Sauvignon Blanc in Australia since 1985 as well too, or probably might have been 1986 before the time the wine landed. And at the time it was, grapes were as scarce as hen's teeth in Marlborough. There's only a few hectares here. So for the first few years, some grapes were sourced out of Hawke's Bay and some wines were made out of Hawke's Bay. And that's where the Twin Islands brand came in, which is one of our other brands. Twin Islands, North Island and South Island, it's a blend of both. But look, since fairly shortly after I started in 98, the future was seen to be in Marlborough, and the small amount of Hawke's Bay fruit that was sourced was, we moved away from that and focused 100% on Marlborough. So started off with Sauvignon. Our first Chardonnay we made in Marlborough was 1989, off a vineyard in Renwick, which we now own. So we've actually been making Chardonnay off a single site in Renwick since 1989. So that's as good a track record, I think, on a site that anyone can come up with. It's a bit like Grandad's favourite shovel. It's had 2 handles and 3 new heads as it's been replanted. But we have actually been growing and making Chardonnay off that site since 1989. 91, we introduced the Nautilus Cuvée, which is our sparkling wine, and that's probably domestically our best known product. So, that established itself very quickly as a benchmark quality New Zealand sparkling wine, and has held that position ever since, which is great. And I also consider myself very fortunate to have been able to make premium sparkling wine my entire career, because even when I did my apprenticeship with Celax, they were one of the first two companies in New Zealand to produce premium, method champenois sparkling wine. So, that's a little aside, but I do enjoy making sparkling wine, and not everyone gets to do that. So that's been a real, bonus, I guess. We introduced Pinot Gris in 2000, and we were sort of one of the first companies in Marlborough to sort of go down the Pinot Gris path. Back then, it was an alternative variety, on the wine list. Now it's a very much an established category. We used to make a Cabernet Merlot blend, believe it or not, back in the late 90s. But I think in 10 years we made one really good wine, 3 or 4 not bad wines, and 5 or 6 pretty average ones. So that's where we sort of saw the transition for red table wine to go, focus on Pinot Noir. So I think the last Cabernet Merlot blend we made was 2001. And by that stage we'd built the Pinot winery, so we're transitioning across to Pinot. What else? We do make 3 brands here too. So we've got Nautilus, which is our premium brand, Opawa, which is a mid-tier brand, and then Twin Islands, which is just a Sauvignon Blanc. So we make another small amount of vintage rosé sparkling wine. We flirted with Gruner Veltliner. I love Gruner. I think it's a great variety. I enjoy drinking it, enjoy making it, but it's a tough sell. It's a wine enthusiast wine rather than doesn't seem to have natural consumer appeal. And then the most recent project we've been doing is Albarino. And we've actually been doing that for 10 years now. And when we had both Albarino and Gruner side by side in our cellar door, we would be selling sort of 4 or 5 bottles of Albarino for every one of Gruner. So we've transitioned away from Gruner. We're actually pulling out we had a few vines left, which we're pulling them out now. They've gone. And we're planting a little bit more Albarino. So Albarino, I think, has got a great future. It's got natural consumer appeal, and in Marlborough, we can produce a really distinctive wine here.
Absolutely. And I think in terms of an offering of another alternate, offering to Sauvignon Blanc, it's beautiful in that it's got this, lovely acid line that, clearly New Zealand and people that are looking for New Zealand wines do enjoy with Sauvignon Blanc, but then it's just got such a basket of fruits. And I think the Albarino that you guys make is fabulous, a really wonderful example. And I can definitely see why people thoroughly love it and enjoy it. And I'd like to see more Albarino from New Zealand, and certainly from other producers as well. I also want to talk a bit about your Pinot Noirs, because they stopped me in my tracks with some of the incredible whole bunch work that you're doing, but the sites in particular, and just the purity and clarity and the definition of your Pinot Noirs were just a real highlight for me on that trip. Tell me a little bit about your approach with Pinot Noir.
Yeah. Well, I guess we over 20 years ago when we built the winery, that was the first step. And at that point we were sort of planting Pinot probably throughout the valley, either in our own vineyard resources or with growers, and discovering, where to grow it and how to grow it. And, for the first 10 years, it was really that, just kind of finding our feet. And this is probably a story that's mirrored with other Marlborough producers as well too. We were probably one of the first to kind of go down that path and take it from, okay, we want to make, rather than doing it, on a small scale out the back of the winery, it's like, well, how can we make a say, more commercial quantity, and what equipment do we need to do that? So we set up our winery with a focus on Pinot Noir. And then over the years, there's the, I guess, understanding that for table wine, Pinot's better suited to the clay soils that are in Marlborough rather than, say, the broad riverbed where a lot of the original plantings were. There's some people say that we had the wrong clones on the wrong sites in Marlborough in the early years. I put a slight twist on that, in that they were the right clones on the right sites, but for sparkling, not for table. And then, so we ended up purchasing a vineyard in the Omaka Valley on the hills and the clay soils in 2007, and that's when we sort of really got getting that understanding of that's where we want to focus for premium Pinot. On the stones, you get bright tannins and quite grainy, bright aromatics and quite grainy tannins, but they never quite come together. Whereas off the clay, you get this lovely mid-palate fruit sweetness and this really fine-grained tannin. So I kind of find it a little bit interesting that Marlborough Pinot has this this finesse and fineness and delicacy, whereas our aromatic whites are bold and brash and sort of in your face, yet the Pinot seems to be almost in some ways opposite in terms of style. Obviously it has that core of primary fruit, but I mean that's typically a New Zealand thing anyway. So I guess, the first decade was about just experimenting and finding where to grow and how to grow it, and getting new clonal material in the ground. The next decade was sort of learning about those sites. And then probably from 2019, I think would be the watershed year, or probably the start of our third decade of Pinot making, where it's all come together. We've got the right clones on the right sites, enough fine age to make a difference, and we've been working with these vineyards for 15 odd years, so we're starting to get a good understanding of how to get the best out of them, and what they will offer in terms of wines. So that's and that's been really exciting to see part of that. And I guess probably an early criticism of Marlborough Pinot was it was probably quite sweet fruited, but propped up with some new oak and quite simple wines. For us, along with the vine age impact, where we're getting all the structure from the grape rather than oak. Oak sort of falls back into a much more of a supporting role rather than a up there with the lead singer as it was in the early days. And we've gone down the path of incorporating whole bunch into our ferments, and that for me is adding that extra layer of complexity and some florals and spice to the aromatics, and another layer in the tannins. And that's I was fortunate enough in 2004 to do my one vintage in Burgundy, but I did it at Domaine Dujac, so it was a pretty good place to work. And of course, they are all about whole bunch. So went over there, had a great time, as you would expect. Got to taste wines I'd never get to taste over here. Came back, it's like, aha, I've got the answer. Let's try whole bunch. Was a little bit, okay, how far deep do we go down this rabbit hole? I'll take some of our sort of mid-range quality fruit and try some whole bunch on that. I don't want to risk the very best of the stuff. And had a crack and got a mid-range result, and thought, that probably was could have seen that coming. Then went to one of our Awatere sites, which is our sort of, we were getting some really good quality Pinot out of the Awatere at the time, and then a couple of years later tried it on that, and thought, no, this looks like it's working, but it was all done on quite a small scale, and it wasn't really until after we'd been working with our hillside clay-based clay soil vineyards, that we started to see it making a significant impact. And we've got our own Clay Hills vineyard that we purchased in 2007. It was planted in 1999. And in 2011, I did a whole bunch trial with that fruit alongside some young fruit that was only sort of about 5 years old, the vines, from a very similar site from a grower. So we did the sort of, say, 20% whole bunch down in the bottom of the tank. Came in the next morning, tasted the juice from the Clay Hill site, and it looked really great. It's integrated and, adding a bit of spice, tasted the juice from the similar site but young vines, and it tasted like Japanese green tea. It's like, oh, bugger, what have I done? By the time that wine went through fermentation and malo and maturation in barrel, it became an interesting blend component, but would never have been a standalone wine at the time. So that's where, I guess, from my experience, whole bunches really only starts to work when you've got at least some vine age, probably 10, 12, ideally 15 years. Because later with that vineyard that was young at the time, 5 or 6 years down the track, we went back to using whole bunch with that, and it was working. So that's been my experience, that for whole bunch to work, you generally need some vine age rather than young fruit.
I love what you have been able to kind of express, and the same way you did when we were on site is just about that kind of journey with whole bunch. And I love that you've also talked about doing whole bunch, with certain parcels and then kind of blending that back into a final wine. And I like that you've been able to communicate that journey, because I know a lot of other people probably would have kept all of those secrets close to their chest and let everybody else just go through the process. But it was really good for me to hear about, where you've gone and to see the finished product now. I just thought, God, these are spot on. You clearly have had a lot of time to get to know what works on your sites and what doesn't. And you really see that in the final wines.
Yeah, no, thank you. And look, and that's one of the advantages of staying somewhere for a long time, because you do get, every vintage is different. Every vintage you learn something, but you can, accumulate all that knowledge, and it does help you, make better wine. And I guess, we went through got to the point where pretty much everything we were handpicking, we were incorporating a whole bunch component in. And then we started trialing these 100% whole bunch ferments, and off a couple of blocks within our vineyard. And interestingly, we get the best results out of clone 5, which is the Pommard clone, rather than the new Dijon clones. But, we started doing these 100% ferments just to see, 100% whole bunch ferments, to see what would happen. And they had less whole bunch character than the 20%, And that's something that was discussed at the Southern Pinot Noir workshop, which is a sort of, it's been going for over 30 years. It's a winemaker's Pinot workshop that's happens in New Zealand, where we do go and share knowledge. And people were going, whole bunch, you either go 20 or you go 100. You don't go in between. And so that's where I sort of, that's the advice I was given. So I came and tried it in our winery and got a similar experience. And to the point where, recent years, rather than, for our little, the wine that we bottle under the Clay Hills label, it's a blend of a small amount of 100% and a larger amount of 100% destemmed. And so we're making that whole bunch decision before it goes to barrel rather than before fermentation. And interestingly, this year, I think that's really paid off. And in fact, we've ended up using less whole bunch this year than we have in previous years. And by doing that, leaving that decision till after the wines have been pressed off, we realised that a lower level was much more appropriate this year than it would have. If we'd just gone on the start and thrown it in as we were processing the fruit, we probably would have ended up with making a lesser wine. So yeah, it's been a fun thing to do, and part of it's that often with whether it's Pinot or any variety, when you start trialing some different things, often it's to make something that adds value to a blend, but every now and then you come across something that goes, that needs to be bottled by itself, that deserves to stand alone. And that's what we did with the 100% whole bunch Pinot. So we now release a wine that's 100% whole bunch ferment.
And it's bloody awesome. Well, I don't know the next time I'll be in New Zealand, and I've got 5 more questions, but we're going to have to rapid fire them. Are you ready, Clive?
Yep, go for it.
Okay. This might be hard, but I have all the faith in you. Who is a mentor who influenced your career?
Darryl Woolley, who he was who I worked for at CLAX, and he came down to Marlborough and then ended up CLAX got bought by Nautilus, who got bought by Constellation. But he's Australian gentleman that came over. He's hasn't got a huge profile in the Marlborough wine industry. He's now retired, but he's connected to a lot of people. So a lot of people have worked with Darryl in their formative years, and then gone on and had successful careers with other wineries. But I served my apprenticeship with Darryl, and I've got a lot of respect for him, and he taught me a lot in those early days.
Love it. Who is an up-and-coming winemaker and one to watch?
He's probably marginal on being calling up and coming. I think he's probably arrived, but Murray Cook at Dog Point, that's his day job, but he makes a little bit of Chardonnay under his own brand.
Doesn't he ever?
Yeah. So, and look, it's probably there's others as well, and that's what I think is quite exciting at the moment in the New Zealand wine industry. We're very well established, but there's a younger generation coming through that is making wine, and some of them are going down the natural pathway and all those sorts of things. But, they're committing, and they're establishing brands often as a sideline. But and probably not all of them will be successful, but some of them will, and some of them will stick, and they'll be brands that will grow and prosper in the future, which I think is quite exciting.
Absolutely. I totally agree with you. If you could make wine in another region in the world, where would it be if it's not New Zealand?
Oh, look, well, Burgundy, obviously, from a Pinot Noir perspective, but I also quite like Oregon. I think, from a language perspective, that would probably be slightly easier, but I think Oregon's quite an exciting region as well too.
Mm. And if there was a region in New Zealand, someone gave you a plot to make one go of something off, where would you be in New Zealand?
I think probably North Canterbury, actually. I think there's some really interesting stuff coming out of North Canterbury across both aromatic whites and Pinot. So there's a good vibe there, and I kind of like the style of wines that are coming out of that region as well too. They're not necessarily the big brash, bold in your face wines, but there's some really sort of interesting complex wines coming out of there. So that would be a bit of fun.
Definitely, lots of wines of character. If you're not at the winery and you're not in the vineyard, where would you like to be in your time off?
Well, the Marlborough Sounds is a good playground for us. We used to have a boat. I've sold it now, so my kids have left home, so my crew's gone. But look, we are lucky in this country that and this region that we're quite central to lots of different things. Although I must admit, my wife and I, now the kids have left home, are taking the advantage to travel. So we're also enjoying the post-COVID getting back into international travel and visiting some countries around the world.
Yeah, I love that. Clive, if you could only drink 3 beverages for the rest of your life, what would they be and why?
So, well, obviously wine would feature a part of that. And I do drink quite a lot of Riesling because I don't make a Riesling, so I can drink that for pleasure. But when you look at if you do the recycling bin test, clearly the wine I drink the most of is Chardonnay. So I don't think I could live without Chardonnay. Gin and tonic, because that's just an absolute delight over summer, and there's so much interesting stuff going on with the gins that can keep you amused and entertained for quite some time. But probably my go-to other drink or cocktail would be a Negroni. I do love a good Negroni.
You're in very good company with those three, I have to say.
Yeah, I know. It's not particularly outlandish by any means, but, there's a reason that they're popular.
That's for sure. That's for sure. You're not going to be alone drinking, that's for sure.
No, that's right.
Clive, I think what you're doing over there is absolutely fantastic. I've loved hearing your stories, and I think, Nautilus is very lucky to have you. Thank you for spending some time with me today, and I hope that we get to see each other again sometime, and maybe over a gin and tonic.
Indeed. Look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Clive. Cheers to you.
Cheers. See you.
This is Over a Glass. I'm Shanteh Wale. Stay tuned for more stories from the world of wine and drinks. Listen in every Thursday on your podcast app. Follow us on Instagram @overaglasspod and contact us at overaglass@deepintheweeds.com.au.